Every afternoon in the quiet garden of the Harrington estate, a 13-year-old girl sat reading to a blind woman. No one paid attention. Until one day Alexander Harrington, the billionaire known for his cold detachment, stumbled upon them by accident. The woman was his mother, recovering from a stroke that had stolen her sight and most of her memory. She barely recognized anyone anymore, but when she heard the girl's voice reading, "You are braver than you believe, stronger than you seem, and smarter than you think," tears rolled down her cheeks. From that moment, Alexander began watching from the shadows, and what he discovered shattered him. The truth wasn't just about kindness. It was about lost longing and a little girl trying to heal her own broken heart by mending someone else's. Helen had worked at the Harrington estate for nearly a decade. She was responsible for the West Garden, a sprawling sanctuary of roses, stone benches, and ancient oak trees that stretched their branches like protective arms over the estate's quietest corner. It was also where Mrs. Margaret Harrington spent most of her days. Margaret had suffered a stroke 8 months earlier. The doctors said she was fortunate to survive, but the cost had been steep. Her vision was gone. Her memory came and went like tide. Some days she knew where she was. Other days, she asked for people who had been dead for years. Alexander had hired the best nurses, the finest therapists, ensured she had every medical comfort money could provide. But he was never there himself. Helen understood. The man ran an empire. Time was a currency he couldn't afford to waste. Still, she noticed the silence that hung around Mrs. Margaret like fog. The way the woman's hands trembled when she sat alone. The way she sometimes whispered names into the empty air, waiting for answers that never came. Helen's daughter Lila often came to the estate after school. 13 years old, with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail and eyes that seemed older than her age. She was quiet by nature, the kind of child who observed more than she spoke. One Thursday afternoon, while Helen trimmed the hedges near the garden pavilion, Lila wandered into the library, a room filled with leather-bound classics and the scent of aging paper. She found a book lying open on the windowsill, its pages yellowed with time. Winnie the Pooh. The cover was worn, the corners soft from years of handling. Inside the front cover, written in faded ink, were the words, "To Alexander, may you always remember the 100-acre wood. Love, Mother." Lila carefully carried it outside. Mrs. Margaret sat in her wheelchair beneath the oak tree, face turned toward the sun she could no longer see. "Mrs. Harrington." Lila's voice was gentle. The older woman's head turned slightly. "Yes. I found this book. I think it might be yours." Lila placed it in Margaret's hands. The woman's fingers traced the cover slowly, as if reading braille that wasn't there. Her breath caught. "I used to read this to my son," she whispered, "when he was small. When he still needed me." Lila hesitated, then sat down on the grass beside the wheelchair. "Would you like me to read it to you?" Margaret's clouded eyes glistened. "You would do that?" "I'd like to." And so Lila opened the book and began. Her voice was clear and unhurried, each word given space to breathe. She didn't rush through sentences or stumble over descriptions. She read the way someone reads to a person they love, with intention, with care. Margaret listened, and for the first time in months, she smiled. Not the polite smile she gave to nurses. Not the distant, confused expression she wore when people spoke too quickly. A real smile. When Lila finished the first chapter, Margaret reached out and found her hand. "What's your name, dear?" "Lila." "Will you come back tomorrow, Lila?" "Yes, ma'am, I will." From that day forward, it became their ritual. Every afternoon after school, Lila would arrive with a book. Sometimes the same one. Sometimes something new she'd found on the library shelves. She read about Christopher Robin and Piglet, about secret gardens and little princes, about characters who felt lost and found their way home. And Margaret, who had been disappearing into the fog of her own mind, began to return. She laughed at the funny parts, gasped at the sad ones, asked questions about the stories, remembered details from one day to the next. Helen watched from a distance, her heart swelling with something she couldn't quite name. Her daughter had given this lonely woman something no amount of money could buy: companionship, presence, a reason to stay. But what Helen didn't know yet, what none of them knew, was that someone else had started watching too. From the window of his study, Alexander Harrington stood in the shadows, looking down at the garden where his mother sat beside a girl he'd never met. And for the first time in years, he saw his mother smile. Alexander Harrington was a man built from discipline and distance. At 43, he controlled a financial empire worth billions. His decisions moved markets. His name appeared in boardrooms across 3 continents. He woke at 5 every morning, worked until midnight, and measured his life in quarterly reports and acquisition deals. Emotion he had learned long ago was a liability. After his father died when he was 19, Alexander had made a promise to himself: he would never be weak again. Never vulnerable. Never dependent on anything he couldn't control. He had kept that promise for 24 years. His mother's stroke had tested it. When the hospital called, he'd been in Tokyo closing a merger. He flew back immediately, hired the best neurologists money could buy, converted the west wing of the estate into a full medical suite. He did everything right, except stay. He told himself she had everything she needed: round-the-clock care, physical therapy, a chef preparing meals tailored to her recovery. What more could he offer that professionals couldn't do better? So he returned to work, to meetings, to the life that made sense to him. He visited on Sundays sometimes, sat with her for 20 minutes, asked the nurses for updates, then left relieved to escape the suffocating quiet of her confusion. But lately something had changed. The nurses reported that Margaret was sleeping better, eating more, even laughing occasionally. Alexander didn't understand it. Nothing in her treatment had changed. One Wednesday, he left the office early, a rarity because a conference call had been canceled. He arrived home just after 4 in the afternoon, sunlight still golden across the grounds. As he walked past the library toward his study, he heard something. A voice. Young. Clear. Reading aloud. He paused. The sound was coming from the garden. Curious, he moved to the window and looked down. There, beneath the oak tree, sat his mother in her wheelchair. And beside her, cross-legged on the grass, was a girl he didn't recognize. She held a book open in her lap and was reading with a cadence that felt almost musical. His mother's face was turned toward the girl, head tilted as if trying to catch every syllable. And she was smiling. Not the vacant, medicated smile he'd grown accustomed to. A real smile. The kind he hadn't seen since before the stroke. Since before his father died. Since he was a child himself. Alexander's chest tightened. He left his study and walked downstairs through the hall out into the garden. The girl noticed him first. She looked up startled and quickly closed the book. His mother turned her head slightly. "Someone's here." "Mother," Alexander said, his voice cooler than he intended. "Who is this?" Margaret's expression didn't falter. "This is Lila. She reads to me." Alexander's eyes moved to the girl. She looked about 13, wearing a school uniform, her hands clutching the book like a shield. "And who gave you permission to be here?" he asked. Lila glanced toward the hedge line where Helen had appeared, face pale with alarm. "I'm sorry, Mr. Harrington," Helen said quickly, stepping forward. "My daughter didn't mean any harm. I should have asked first." "She wasn't causing harm," Margaret interrupted, her voice surprisingly firm. "She was keeping me company." Alexander frowned. "Mother, you have nurses. You have staff. You don't need—" "I need her," Margaret said quietly. The words landed like stones in still water. Alexander stared at his mother, caught off guard by the conviction in her tone. "She reads to me the way you used to be read to," Margaret continued. "The way I used to read to you before you grew up and forgot." Something flickered across Alexander's face. Not quite pain. Not quite guilt. Something he had no name for. He looked at Lila again. The girl hadn't moved, hadn't spoken. Just sat there, small and uncertain, clutching that old worn book. "What are you reading?" he asked, his voice softer now. Lila hesitated, then held up the cover. Winnie the Pooh. Alexander's breath caught. He knew that book. He knew the inscription inside. He knew the hours his mother had spent reading it to him when he was too afraid to sleep alone, when thunder shook the house, when the world felt too big and he felt too small. He turned away, jaw tight. "Fine," he said. "She can stay." Helen exhaled in relief. Margaret reached out, finding Lila's hand. "Thank you, Alexander." He didn't respond. Just walked back toward the house, shoulders rigid, hands clenched at his sides. But as he reached the door, he paused, turned, looked back at the garden one more time. His mother was laughing at something Lila had read. A real laugh. Light and unburdened. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Alexander felt the walls he'd built around himself crack just a little. He didn't know what to do with that feeling. So he did what he always did. He walked away. But this time he couldn't stop thinking about the girl with the book and the sound of his mother's laughter echoing through the garden he'd long since stopped visiting. The days that followed became a rhythm. Every afternoon at 3:30, Lila arrived at the estate with her school bag and a book chosen carefully from the library shelves. She read everything: The Secret Garden, Little Women, The Velveteen Rabbit, The Little Prince, Charlotte's Web, stories about belonging, about love that endures, about being seen when the world overlooks you. Margaret listened to every word as if it were water, and she'd been wandering a desert. Her nurses noticed the change immediately. "She's eating better," one reported to Alexander during a Sunday check-in. "Her vital signs are stronger. She's even asking about the time waiting for something." "Waiting for what?" Alexander asked. "For the girl. For story time." Alexander said nothing, but the words stayed with him. By the third week, Margaret's sleep patterns had shifted entirely. She used to lie awake most nights staring into the darkness she couldn't see, restless and disoriented. The doctors had prescribed medication. It helped, but only barely. Now she slept soundly. But only after Lila read to her. The night nurse mentioned it in passing. "It's the strangest thing, Mr. Harrington. If the girl doesn't come, Mrs. Margaret won't settle. She'll ask for her, wait for her. But the moment that child reads, she drifts off like she's being sung a lullaby." Alexander's frown deepened. "That doesn't make sense." "Maybe it doesn't have to," the nurse replied gently. That night, Alexander did something he hadn't done in months. He opened the security feed. The estate had cameras throughout the grounds, not for surveillance but for safety. He'd installed them after his mother's stroke in case she wandered or fell. He pulled up the archive, scrolled back through days of footage, and he watched. There was Lila sitting cross-legged on the grass, book open in her lap. His mother leaning forward in her wheelchair, hands resting on the armrests, face calm and attentive. He turned up the volume. Lila's voice came through clearly, soft but articulate. "What is real?" asked the rabbit one day. "Real isn't how you are made," said the skin horse. "It's a thing that happens to you. When a child loves you for a long, long time, not just to play with, but really loves you, then you become real." Margaret's hand reached out trembling and found Lila's shoulder. "That's beautiful," she whispered. "It is," Lila agreed. Do you think people can become real again, even after they've been forgotten?" Lila paused. Then, with a wisdom that seemed too old for her years, she said, "I think love makes people real. And I don't think you've been forgotten, Mrs. Margaret." Margaret's face crumpled. She began to cry, not in despair, in relief. Lila set the book down and took the woman's hand, saying nothing, just holding it. Alexander stared at the screen, throat tight. He scrolled to another day. This time Lila was reading Anne of Green Gables. Margaret laughed, genuinely laughed at Anne's dramatic declaration about kindred spirits. "I used to be like that," Margaret said wistfully. "Full of big feelings. Your age, maybe. Always reading. Always dreaming." "What happened?" Lila asked. "Life, I suppose. Responsibility. I became a wife, a mother. I forgot how to dream in words." "You can still dream," Lila said simply. "The stories are still here." Margaret smiled. "You remind me of someone." "Who?" "My son. Before the world made him serious." Alexander's hand froze on the mouse. He watched himself in the reflection of the screen, a man in his 40s, face lined with stress, eyes tired from years of not sleeping enough, not feeling enough. He clicked to the most recent footage. Lila was reading The Little Prince now. "It is only with the heart that one can see rightly," she read. What is essential is invisible to the eye. Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. I wish my son could hear this. Maybe he will someday, Lila said softly. He's so far away. Even when he's here, he's far away. Lila hesitated. Then she said, My dad was like that too. Before he got sick. He worked all the time. And then, he didn't have time anymore. Margaret reached for her hand. He passed away last year. Oh, sweetheart. It's okay. I wish I'd told him it was okay to stop, to just sit, to just be. There was a long silence on the screen. Then Margaret said, You're very wise for someone so young. I just read a lot, Lila said with a small smile. Alexander closed the laptop. He sat in the darkness of his study, the weight of what he'd seen pressing against his chest like a hand. His mother was healing. Not because of medicine. Not because of money. Because a 13-year-old girl sat with her every day and read stories that reminded her she was still alive. And he, her own son, hadn't done that once. He thought of all the Sundays he'd sat in that room for 20 minutes checking his watch, eager to leave. All the conversations he'd avoided because they made him uncomfortable. All the years he'd confused providing with presents. He stood and walked to the window. Down below, the garden lights glowed softly. Empty now. But tomorrow at 3:30, Lila would return. And his mother would be waiting. For the first time in years, Alexander felt something he couldn't name. Not quite regret. Not quite longing. Something closer to recognition. As if he were seeing himself clearly for the first time. And he didn't like what he saw. It was a rainy Thursday afternoon when Alexander decided to walk through the library. He told himself he was looking for a file. A contract he might have left on the reading table weeks ago. But truthfully, he didn't know why he was there. The room smelled of old paper and lemon polish. Shelves lined every wall filled with books he'd inherited but never read. His father's collection. His mother's favorites. Volumes that had once meant something to people who were gone or fading. On the small table by the window, he found a stack of books set aside. The Little Prince, Anne of Green Gables, Charlotte's Web, Lila's selections for the week. He picked up the top one, Winnie the Pooh, the same worn copy from his childhood, and opened it absently. A folded piece of paper slipped out and fluttered to the floor. Alexander bent down and picked it up. The handwriting was careful. Rounded, the letters formed with the deliberate precision of someone still learning cursive. He unfolded it. Dear Mrs. Margaret, I wanted to ask you something, but I'm too nervous to say it out loud. When you talk, your voice sounds like my mom's did when she used to read to me before bed. And when you laugh, it reminds me of someone who loves easily. I never got to meet my grandmother. She passed away before I was born. So I don't know what it feels like to have one. Would it be okay if I pretended you were mine? Just when we read together, I know you might not remember this tomorrow. But I'll remember for both of us. Love, Lila. Alexander stood frozen, the paper trembling in his hands. He read it again. Then a third time. His throat tightened. This child, this girl who owed them nothing, had walked into his mother's life and offered her something he hadn't even realized was missing. Not care. Not service. Connection. He carefully refolded the note and slipped it into his pocket. Then he left the library and walked toward his mother's room. He paused outside the door. Inside, he could hear the night nurse speaking softly, and his mother's voice clearer than it had been in months. If my son would just sit still long enough to listen, Margaret was saying, he'd realize that all the money in the world can't buy what that little girl gives me every day. The nurse responded quietly, What's that, Mrs. Margaret? The feeling that I still matter. That I'm not just a problem to be managed. Alexander's hand fell from the door handle. He turned and walked away, each step heavier than the last. He made it to the garage, got into his car, sat in the driver's seat with the engine off and the rain drumming against the windshield. And then, for the first time since his father's funeral, Alexander Harrington broke. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just silent tears that came without permission sliding down his face as he gripped the steering wheel and tried to breathe. He had given his mother everything. The best doctors, the finest care, a home filled with people paid to keep her comfortable. But he hadn't given her himself. He had been so afraid of her confusion, her fragility, the reminder of his own helplessness, that he'd hired other people to love her in his place. And a 13-year-old girl had walked in and done what he couldn't. She had simply shown up. He thought about the note in his pocket. About Lila asking permission to call his mother grandmother. About a child who had lost her own father reaching out to someone else's mother because both of them needed to be needed. About how love, real love, didn't require credentials or qualifications. It only required presence. The rain continued to fall. Alexander sat in the dark car, hands shaking chest tight with something that felt like grief and gratitude tangled together. He pulled out his phone, scrolled through his calendar. Meetings stacked back to back for the next 3 weeks. Conference calls, board presentations, acquisition negotiations. A life constructed to avoid stillness, to avoid feeling. He opened his email and began typing. Cancel my morning meetings tomorrow. Indefinitely. He hesitated, then added, I need to be home. He sent it before he could change his mind. Then he sat there a while longer, letting the tears come, letting himself feel the full weight of everything he'd been running from. His mother was slipping away. Not because of the stroke. Because he had let her slip. And if he didn't stop now, if he didn't turn around and walk back into that house and sit with her, really sit with her the way Lila did, he would lose her completely. Not to death. To his own cowardice. Alexander wiped his face with the back of his hand. He got out of the car and walked back through the rain toward the house. He didn't know what he was going to say. He didn't know how to undo years of distance in a single conversation. But he knew one thing. Tomorrow when Lila came to read, he would be there. Not watching from a window. Not hiding behind a screen. There. In the garden. Listening. The way he should have been all along. The next afternoon, Alexander was waiting in the garden when Lila arrived. She stopped short when she saw him sitting on the stone bench near his mother's usual spot, hands folded, expression unreadable. Helen, walking a few steps behind her daughter, looked alarmed. Mr. Harrington, I didn't know you'd be. It's fine, Helen, he said quietly. I'd like to speak with Lila, if that's all right. Lila glanced at her mother, uncertain. Helen gave a small nod, though worry flickered in her eyes. Alexander waited until Helen had moved toward the rose beds before he spoke. Why do you do this? He asked. Lila blinked. Sir. Read to my mother. Spend your afternoons here. You're 13. You could be with friends, doing anything else. He paused. So why? Lila looked down at the book in her hands. It was a long moment before she answered. Because she asked me to, she said simply. And because her voice reminds me of my mom's. Your mother's here, Helen. No, I mean, when my mom used to read to my dad. Lila's voice softened. Before he got sick. Alexander's expression shifted. Your father. He died last year. Cancer. She said it matter-of-factly, but her fingers tightened on the book. He worked all the time. Investment banking. He was always traveling, always busy. Just like... She stopped herself. Like me, Alexander finished. Lila's cheeks colored. I didn't mean... It's true. He leaned back against the bench. Go on? She hesitated, then continued. When he got too sick to work, my mom would read to him. Every night. The same book she used to read to me when I was little. And for the first time, he was just there. Present. Not thinking about the next deal or the next meeting. Just listening. Her voice wavered. He told me right before he died that those were the best months of his life. Even though he was dying. Because he finally stopped running. Alexander's throat tightened. When I heard Mrs. Margaret's voice, Lila continued, the way she talks, the way she listens, it reminded me of those nights. And I thought maybe I could give her what my mom gave my dad. Just someone to be with. Someone who's not in a hurry to leave. She looked up at him, eyes bright with unshed tears. I know I'm just the housekeeper's daughter. I know I don't belong here, but your mom makes me feel like I have a grandmother. And I think maybe I make her feel like she still has someone who needs her." Alexander couldn't speak. The weight of her words settled over him like a shroud. Before he could respond, his mother's voice called from the doorway. "Alexander, is that you?" He turned. Margaret stood in her wheelchair, guided by a nurse, her sightless eyes turned toward the sound of his voice. "Yes, Mother. I'm here." "Come closer." He walked over, knelt beside her chair. She reached out, found his face with her hands. Her fingers traced his jaw, his cheeks, as if memorizing him. "You used to be afraid of the dark," she said softly. "Do you remember?" He nodded, then realized she couldn't see. "Yes. I would sit beside your bed and read to you until you fell asleep, every night for years." Her hands trembled. "And then one day you didn't need me anymore. You grew up, you got strong, and you stopped letting me in, Mother." "You're not afraid of the dark anymore, Alexander. You're afraid of the light." Her voice broke. "You're afraid of being seen, of being loved, of needing someone." He closed his eyes, her words cutting deeper than any blade. "When your father died," she continued, "I watched you build walls. I watched you decide that caring was weakness, that love was a liability." She cupped his face. "But you're wrong, my darling boy. You're so wrong. I didn't want to be hurt again," he whispered. "So you chose to be alone instead." Margaret's tears fell freely now. "And in protecting yourself, you've lost yourself." Lila stood a few feet away, tears streaming down her own face. Alexander looked at her. At this child who had lost her father and still chose to show up, to give, to love without guarantee. "I'm sorry," he said, voice cracking. He didn't know if he was speaking to his mother or to Lila or to himself. "I'm so sorry." Margaret pulled him close, holding him the way she had when he was small. "Then stop running," she whispered. "Stop hiding. Just stay." And for the first time in 20 years, Alexander Harrington let himself be held, let himself be loved, let himself be human. Lila quietly opened her book and began to read. Not because anyone asked, but because she understood what they both needed. A story, a voice, a reminder that they weren't alone. And Alexander stayed. Finally, he stayed. 3 months later, Alexander stood on a stage he never imagined he'd build. Behind him, a banner stretched across the wall, Voice of Light Foundation, bringing stories to those who cannot see. The ballroom was filled with donors, journalists, community leaders, and volunteers. But Alexander's eyes found only 3 people in the front row. His mother, seated in her wheelchair, dressed elegantly, smiling with a clarity she hadn't possessed in over a year. Helen, in a simple but dignified dress, hands folded in her lap, eyes glistening with pride. And Lila, wearing a blue dress her mother had bought for the occasion, looking both nervous and radiant. Alexander cleared his throat and began. "Most of you know me as a businessman, someone who deals in numbers, strategies, returns on investment." He paused. "But this foundation isn't about profit. It's about something I almost lost because I was too busy counting money to count what really mattered." Soft murmurs rippled through the crowd. "6 months ago, my mother suffered a stroke that took her vision. I hired the best doctors, provided the best care, gave her everything money could buy." His voice softened. "Everything except myself." Margaret's hand reached out. A nurse placed a tissue in her palm. "And then a 13-year-old girl did what I couldn't. She sat with my mother and read to her. Not because she was paid, not because it benefited her, but because she understood something I'd forgotten." He looked directly at Lila. "That a voice can heal a heart more powerfully than any medicine. That presence is worth more than presence. That sometimes all someone needs is to know they're not forgotten." The room was silent. Voice of Light will provide free audiobooks, volunteer readers, and literacy programs for the visually impaired, the elderly, the isolated, anyone who needs to hear a human voice reminding them they matter. Applause began to build. And I'm honored to announce that Helen Torres will serve as our program coordinator. He gestured toward Helen, who looked stunned. And Lila Torres, our youngest and wisest team member, will be our very first voice ambassador. The applause grew louder. Lila's eyes went wide. Her mother squeezed her hand. Alexander stepped down from the podium and walked to where they sat. He knelt beside his mother's wheelchair. "Thank you," he whispered, "for not giving up on me." Margaret smiled through her tears. "I never could." He turned to Lila. "And thank you for showing me what I was too afraid to see." Lila's voice was soft but steady. "You would have figured it out eventually. Maybe. But you saved me years of being lost." As the evening wound down and guests mingled, Alexander stood by the window watching his mother laugh with Lila, their heads close together sharing some private joke. Helen appeared beside him. "You've built something beautiful, Mr. Harrington." He shook his head gently. "No. Your daughter built it. I just finally learned to listen." And for the first time in his life, Alexander Harrington understood what it meant to be truly wealthy. Lila's story teaches us something we often forget in our rush through life. Kindness doesn't need status to be powerful. It doesn't need wealth to create change. It only needs a willing heart and the courage to show up. A voice, genuine, patient, present can heal wounds that medicine cannot touch. Sometimes the blindness we suffer from isn't physical. It's emotional. We become blind to what matters because we're too focused on what we think we need. Alexander had everything except the one thing his mother needed most: him. And a 13-year-old girl carrying her own grief reminded him that love isn't about grand gestures or expensive gifts. It's about sitting beside someone and saying through your presence, "You matter, you're seen, you're not alone." If you believe that kindness can heal the deepest wounds, drop a comment below with these words: "Kindness sees what eyes cannot." And I'm so curious, where in the world are you watching this from, and what time is it where you are sharing in the comments? I'd love to know how far this story has traveled. Thank you for spending your time with me today. To discover more stories like this, check out the other videos on my channel. And don't forget to subscribe to Maid's Daughter Stories, where small acts of courage light up the greatest corners of the world.